This Avalanche Safety Report is brought to you by Mountain TV. Watch Mountain TV anywhere with our free Roku, Apple TV, and Fire TV apps. Learn more at mtn-tv.com.
Joining me today is Brian Lazar, the Deputy Director of the Colorado Avalanche Information Center. He's here to give us an update and the latest on the backcountry conditions and avalanche protocol with safety. Brian, great to have you here on the show again.
Yeah, thanks for having me back.
So I see we're getting a lot of different forms of fresh powder throughout the areas in the mountains. What can you tell us right now coming up as far as danger warnings and safety?
Yeah, we had another active week of avalanche activity and dangerous avalanche conditions. Just in the last week, we had 3 people caught and partially buried in avalanches. Fortunately, this didn't result in any serious injuries or worse. And that was just due to the kind of the snowstorms that rolled through in the earlier part of the week. If I take you over to kind of our homepage map, this gives you a good sense of what happened throughout the week. You can see areas of high danger shifted from the central and southern mountains up into the northern mountains with the storm on the 13th and 14th. And now we're sitting at considerable danger across most of the state. Okay, so you can see right now we're looking at most of the mountains in Colorado are sitting at considerable danger or level 3 out of 5. This is pretty dangerous avalanche conditions. We don't expect lots of spontaneous or naturally releasing avalanches, but many slopes still remain right on the brink for human triggering. There's a little bit of nuance to this. And so if I take you to our Avalanche Explorer, you can see here that we've got 117 avalanches that we've recorded just over the last week. And as the map on the left shows, these are pretty well distributed across the mountains from down south in the southern San Juans all the way up into the Steamboat and Northern Front Range. If we just take a look at avalanches that were maybe big enough to bury or kill a person, you can still see we're looking at 45 avalanches or almost 4 dozen that are big enough to bury or kill somebody. And what's been breaking is 2 flavors. So we've been talking about a drought layer that developed in our November period when we didn't have much snowfall. And if you look at what's going on those northerly facing aspects, you can see that's where we're seeing avalanches break on that drought layer. And they're distributed from the Front Range kind of down through the Central Mountains. If we just look on what's going on east aspects, we're dealing with a slightly different problem where avalanches are breaking on a melt freeze crust that has weak layers just above and below it. And you can see if we look at what's going on just those east-facing slopes, most of those avalanches are confined to the Saguache Range, the Summit County area, and then up through the Front Range along the Continental Divide.
Yeah, Brian, it looks like according to this graph that there is some fairly well consistency with the snowfall in the areas that avalanches are being triggered. Can you break that down a little bit more for us?
Yeah, I can. And so I talked about kind of 2 different problematic weak layers that we're tracking. This image shows the one that's more ubiquitous and widespread across the state, where we've got a slab of overlying snow or stiffer snow resting on this weak layer, very weak snow that formed during our November drought. That's present around the state. The only difference really is how thick and how hard it's a slab. In thinner snowpack areas, like what we're showing in this image, the slab may only be about 1.5 feet or 2 feet thick. In our deeper snowpack areas along kind of our most western mountain ranges, we're looking at slabs of 3 and even 4 feet thick on wind-loaded slopes. On these other aspects, and so here's an example of a slightly thicker slab, about 1.5 feet thick on the drought layer. Here's an example of this other flavor of avalanche, which is confined to more east and southeast facing terrain where we had warm enough temperatures over the last kind of couple weeks to develop a melt freeze crust buried around 2 feet deep on these east facing slopes. And the weak layers sit right above and below this crust. And we've seen this be more of a problematic area in portions of our northern mountains from Summit County and Vail areas extending through the Northern Front Range, Berthoud Pass, all the way up to kind of Cameron Pass. Here's just a variety of avalanches that ran on one of these 2 weak layers, either the melt freeze crust or the drought layer just over the last week. Here's one up in the Gore Range, just north of Summit County, triggered by a snowmobile. This did catch some people. You can see the machine was buried. Someone was partially buried in this avalanche, but fortunately walked away without any serious injuries or worse. Here's another one by up near the Eisenhower Tunnel where you can see the ski tracks coming in and triggered a fairly sizable avalanche which broke down to the ground. Another one, this flavor of avalanche extends all the way down into the San Juan Mountains. So here's one near Red Mountain Pass, which was triggered by a skier. And then here's a snowmobiler, which just triggered a small avalanche along a road cut. And this is not a big or worrisome avalanche, but it's really a good illustration of the kinds of avalanches people are going to be able to trigger this weekend and into early next week. So the reason we're warning about west through north, all the way around to southeast facing aspects, we've got the persistent slab avalanche problems, which means these avalanches are breaking on persistent weak layers. That means they break in really surprising ways. So you need to give steep slopes, steeper than about 30 degrees, a really wide buffer. I really like this photo because we're highlighting essentially higher elevation slopes that have seen a lot of wind loading. And then the areas in these red circles here really indicate the kinds of slopes you want to avoid. You can see that these have obvious signs of wind loading, big, smooth wind pillows, and these are the kinds of things we're talking about avoiding in the avalanche forecast. And lastly, as we mentioned, just because avalanches can be triggered from a distance or from below, you can imagine walking across the flat area down here, which really is an avalanche terrain. But as we've noted before, you need to really be cognizant of the terrain above you. And it's quite possible to trigger an avalanche from down here in the flats that would come down then and run onto you. So these are the kinds of things we want to caution people about.
Well, and I'm also sure that the ever-changing temperatures, warmer, decreasing to colder temperatures, and then the higher elevation along with the winds is a big contributing factor.
Yeah, so whenever we get kind of like warm enough temperatures or enough sunshine to develop crust, we often really want to pay attention to whether or not we get weak layers right around that crust. And then wind is always a big player in Colorado. And wind drifted snow creates stiffer and thicker slabs. And when we're loading those problematic slopes that have the weak layers, that's when we get concerned. So that's why we really want people to pay attention for the obvious signs of wind loaded slopes and stay away from those and give slopes steeper than about 30 degrees a wide buffer.
Yeah. Brian, always great to see you. We're out of time today, but thank you. This is perfect protocol before those that are heading back out into the backcountry this weekend to take advantage of that, enjoy, but also be very cautious and aware. Great to see you.
Great to see you. We'll see you next week.
You can always send footage, contribute reports, and stay up to date with the latest forecast at colorado.gov/avalanche. Enjoy the backcountry and be safe out there.